here at ACT Bloomberg. Of course, this is his first lecture as the Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to do this despite your extremely busy schedule. The topic of the lecture today is: do freebies, subsidies help or hinder growth? Successive Dravidian governments in Tamil Nadu have got a lot of flack and bad press for the subsidies and welfare schemes and are often accused of fiscal profligacy. In fact, two judges at the Madras High Court earlier this year observed that the freebie culture was making the Tamil people lazy, and they wouldn't be surprised if migrants soon became the owners of properties in the state and the sons of the soil working under them. But apart from such alarmist views, what really is the impact of giving subsidies and how do they affect economic growth? Who better than Dr. Thiagarajan, a former banker and a financial expert to boot, to throw light on the topic. But before we start, some ground rules. Please keep your microphone muted during the talk. And if you have any questions, you can use your raise hand feature on the Zoom window or send the questions across on chat and we will raise it. I now request ACJ Bloomberg student Kripa Jayaraman to introduce Dr. Thiagarajan to the audience. Over to you, Kripa.
Good evening, all. Dr.Palanivel Thiagarajan, a two-time MLA from Madurai, is currently the Minister for Finance and Human Resources Management in the Tamil Nadu government. He did a chemical engineering degree from NIT Trichy, a master's degree in operations research, and a PhD in human factors engineering psychology from the State University of New York at Buffalo. He then went on to do an MBA in finance from the prestigious MIT Sloan School of Management. While his career began in consulting, he later moved to work as an investment banker in Lehman Brothers. He quit the company as head of offshore capital markets in 2008. He soon moved to Standard Chartered Bank, where he worked as the managing director for global capital markets, followed by financial market sales. He quit the post in 2014. He moved back to India and then joined the TMK. He represents the fourth generation of his illustrious family's engagement with Dravidian movement. He is well known for articulating his thoughts simply and clearly, especially cutting down the financial jargon, which is the first thing we are taught here, and for his outspoken views on Twitter. The students of Asian College of Journalism welcome you, sir. Today's topic of discussion is: do freebies or subsidies help or hinder growth? Over to you, sir.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come back. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm not sure I want to be famous for my comments on Twitter, but I guess it is what it is. I'm particularly happy to have this topic because I think it's something that is very frequently either misunderstood or confused. Of course, there's a whole different question about where the line between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature ought to be drawn, and whether these days we see that line being increasingly blurred or non-existent. But that's another topic for another day. If I just go back to the topic given to me, why don't we start with at least my understanding of the basic role of government in a civilized society, in a democracy, in a republic. What is the economic kind of role of a government? Because surely nobody has ever said, governments are the greatest creator of jobs or, the greatest drivers of an economy, unless you're Norway or Brunei or Saudi Arabia, where you're getting it out of the ground. And therefore the people's assets drive the economy. The rest of the time, the government is not the primary driver of economic activity. People are, businesses are, individuals are. So in the simplest sense, I would say the job of government in a democracy is really three or four basic things. One, to raise revenues from the people in an equitable and fair manner. In fact, our Economic Advisory Council member, Dr. S. Narayan, former Finance Secretary of India, has said that that really has been seen as the primary role of government, stretching back to the Arthashastra in our culture, that it's really about raising money in a fair and equitable manner and the optimum amount of it. But what do we raise the money for? Then really the second job is to ensure that you provide high quality public goods and services as universally as possible. Drinking water, transportation, education, healthcare, access to opportunity. I would go so far as to say the next role, which most countries explicitly take on, is to ensure that there is a level playing field and to create the environment for growth. So to ensure that the few don't kind of corner the assets, even in capitalism, as our other economic advisor, Reorientation, once wrote in a book, saving capitalism from the capitalists. Don't let the winners get so strong and so big that they can basically take control of the system. So ensuring a level playing field and creating the kind of ecosystem for growth, a good dispute resolution system, strong property rights, good infrastructure that allows private enterprise to come and create growth. And crucially, to provide some protection or support for the poorest, the weakest, the most unfortunate, the most kind of bottom of the economic or other spectrum in a society. A caring and compassionate society is defined by how well you take care of those most in need, not who gets to be rich or how many get to be rich. So in that sense, some of us only may need help temporarily. It may be unemployment insurance. It may be healthcare that one cannot afford and the state must provide. Some may need it for longer durations because of a disability or a differently able person. But the net result is that all civilized societies have some sort of a safety net to provide for those who are in need, either instantaneously or over longer durations of time. In that sense, when we think of subsidies or freebies, really we are talking about that component of it, of what is the role of the government in taking care of people and how do we define where the right line is. Because I think for most of us, this is not a black or white situation, and I'll explain in some detail. So first, let me say that, of course, we can separate subsidies and freebies very clearly. Right? A subsidy is something that is used on a sliding scale. It doesn't have to be the same for all. By definition of freebie, which itself is a bad term, but the definition of freebie, free of cost, is free of cost. It's zero. There's not some people 0 and some people 10. That's not a free of cost. Whereas a subsidy can be some people get 10%, some people 20, some people 15, some people 25. And it is really an incentive alignment or behavior incentivizing kind of tool. So subsidies are used around the world for things like, import substitution. The country decides we no longer want to import this particular type of product. We need to be self-reliant or at least have 50% production. Therefore, we provide subsidies to those who make this product. It can be for export promotion. In our country, we provide a lot of subsidies and benefits to people, particularly when we were not as strong in foreign exchange reserves, to those who would do exports and earn foreign exchange for us. Most states and the union government provide subsidies to entrepreneurs, to small business owners, to people who create jobs, to people who innovate, for people who do startups. So a subsidy is more of an incentive alignment or an incentive creation mechanism, and it can be on a sliding scale. By contrast, a freebie is effectively free of cost. Now, freebie is probably, as I say, a bad term, but let's just say, services without any payment. Every society in the world, bar none, provides something free of payment, right? Whether it's education, whether it's drinking water, whether it's basic healthcare of some minimum sort or emergency. And really, it's a question of degree to who gives what. And I made the point somewhere else that I'll make here again. There is very little correlation between a country's average GDP or per capita GDP and whether that country has poor people or not, because there's another dimension to societies, which is the higher or lower inequality built into the society. I'll give you a couple of examples. So the US is one of the richest countries in the world. Has very high per capita income, somewhere around $52,000 per person. But does that mean that there are no poor people in the US? Of course not. There are so many people who the government of either the state or the federal government provides things like food stamps, meaning they otherwise will not have enough to eat. So, excuse me. So even in the richest societies, there are still people getting government assistance to ensure that they have food, their children have food. In the US, in the income tax system, there's something called earned income credit. People who earn so little that the government uses the mechanism to pay them back and has them file a return, not because they're paying tax, but so they can get a refund, so-called refund for credit they would have otherwise, income they would have otherwise earned. So every society in the world has some people that need help, and the rich doesn't change that. Let's go within India. A state like Gujarat has a slightly higher per capita income than a state like Tamil Nadu. However, if you look at either the per capita consumption or the Gini coefficient or the access to healthcare or the average education or the percentage of girls below 15 who are enrolled in school full-time, there is no comparison. Tamil Nadu is much, much better off in all of those dimensions. It is fundamentally a more equitable society. And that is despite being 10 or 20,000 rupees out of a 2,30,000 or whatever per capita income variation to Gujarat, or lower than. So, the real question then is not, is there or isn't there or should there not be? Of course, every society has some. Really, the two things we should talk about is what kind of free of cost service or product and how is it administered? And that really will be the question whether we think, the real debate would be, in theory, if you were spending money without getting the right outcome for it, then it hurts growth, because I'll give you some examples, but really you could be not just squandering away the public money, but you could be creating problems yourself. As maybe observed, without comment by somebody earlier, that in theory you could be disincentivizing people from doing real work, or somehow creating some new issues. The other extreme is that surely nobody would advocate that we don't provide education for free. Nobody would advocate that we don't provide at least vaccinations for free. I mean, these are all things that is not in the realm of discussion for most reasonable people. So I have picked up about 5 or 6, I've just written myself a little note, examples of what others would consider freebies. And the first problem arises, of course, by what is the definition of a freebie? One man's kind of fundamental service or provision of subsidy or essential facet of civilized society can easily be called another man's freebie. I made this point to the 15th Finance Commission, whose terms of reference included, believe it or not, a clause that said that states which do a lot of populist spending shall be given a lower allocation of tax funds. So I asked the question, how do you define what is populist? Who is an authority? Who has got the definition, from God or from nature to say what is populist or what is not populist? Is subsidy for gas cylinders that was given by the Union government with the face of the Prime Minister, is that considered populist? If that is not populist, why should the government of Tamil Nadu giving subsidies or giving free laptops and cycles to students who are studying be considered populist? So, at some level, all these terms are meaningless, and surely they are subjective. But let me give you some examples, and we'll see whether that makes sense. So clearly, some things that we consider revenue spending or providing free service or free goods to people, particularly the examples I've given. The free noon meal scheme. Tamil Nadu is a pioneer, started in 1921 with the Justice Party government of Madras Corporation providing free breakfast, got expanded, multiple people, multiple times. The second great expansion came with Kamaraj, who expanded to lunch at all schools, but only for poor students. The third big expansion came with MGR, who expanded to all students at school, irrespective of any means testing for whether they needed it or not. And then, of course, Kalangya, who expanded it to protein to include eggs and so forth. Every one of those interventions have fundamentally strengthened and improved our society and made the next generation better equipped to deal with the world than the one before it. And so I would consider that essential investment in the human resources of our state. And in no way would that be considered either populist or freebie. Different people at different times have provided cycles to high school students, to laptops to college-going students, all of which, again, I see that though it's revenue spending for us, in fact, let me put it another way. Were the government to purchase cycles or laptops, we would consider that capital spending because we're acquiring a good that will depreciate over time. But since we buy it and give it to other people, we consider that revenue spending. But those people are the people for whom the government runs. So it's very easy to justify those as investments in the future. They increase the productivity, the access to education, the time spent on studying versus other things. We can even look at subsidies that are somewhat unique to Tamil Nadu, like support for weddings, like the Thali for Tangam for Thali scheme, or what we recently did. The government of Tamil Nadu has fairly, I won't say best in the country, but fairly generous relative to other states, support schemes for expectant mothers. Not only do we provide vitamins and nutrition and counseling and all kinds of other things, but also cash assistance for every expectant mother. We can look at schemes like health insurance and crop insurance, which in some cases we charge notional amounts for, many cases we don't charge anything at all. We use the insurance model just to ensure that only those that really need it get it, and that there's some ceiling on the per person utilization. But really, it is a way of the government protecting the public from bad outcomes, risk that they couldn't otherwise mitigate themselves. Then you have things like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Again, one of our financial advisors, Professor Jean Drees, had a big hand in the creation of that. And even in our recent meeting of the Tamil Nadu Economic Advisory Council, the Chief Minister and the advisors discussed about our commitment to provide 1,000 rupee per woman subsidy, woman household member subsidy, and how soon we could get to implementing that. Now, the MNREGA is a perfect example. If you take the MNREGA and you think of it as a kind of minimum employment or minimum income, basic income guarantee scheme, quasi, then there's two ways of implementing this. One is to implement it in a way that people actually do some work. And there's so much work to be done. There's all these ponds and columns to be, desilted, to be rejuvenated. There's work on roads to be done. There's buildings to be built, schools to be built. There's community centers to be built. So as someone who signs off on these files as a finance minister, I see so many projects and so many initiatives for which the labor can be achieved through the employment guarantee scheme. And that is really a win-win, right? We get the work done. We get some output for it. There's increase in productivity, and people who otherwise were not in the workforce are engaged into the workforce, raises the overall productivity of the state collectively, and ensures that they have basic income, which they otherwise would not have. Now, you could also see in many cases the allegation, at least, I'm not sure who's tracking these cases, but of money being given with no work being done, or money being given to phantom workers, or money being given and that disrupting the local economy. And this I've heard many times, where people say, well, if you go to a village and you pay individuals 150 rupees a day and don't extract any work from them, then really you're making the next best option, which is to work for the farm sector worth something like 300 rupees. So what you've done is you've just increased the wages that the farm sector faces. And if you do that, you have 2-3 basic problems. The first problem is that you have increased the input cost to the farmer. The second is that will reflect in increased food prices at the retail. But most of all, you have effectively created inflation. You have pumped more money into the system without getting more goods. And that is the technical kind of methodology for increasing inflation, is more money chasing the same or fewer goods. So, like with many other schemes, it's really the execution, the implementation, and the context. And I'll get into that or let me just actually go aside here for a second. Surely all these concerns I have about MNREGA, about whether it causes real work and all that, is much more of concern or much greater value when we are in a tight economy and the labor market is tight, or where there's kind of already full employment and things like that. I really don't worry about any of these things. If we are in a pandemic and the economy is in a huge slump and people are having a hard time finding a way to make a living, then of course all these norms don't apply. Then I say, please give the money as fast as you can to as many people as you can, because that's how you stimulate demand and keep people out of poverty. So, many of these things are also a grayscale in terms of what context, what part of the economic cycle, are you in a disaster situation? Are you in a regular situation? Are you a $5,000 per capita country? Are you a $50,000 per capita country? Are you in a tight labor market? Are you in a slack labor market? Is inflation under control? Is inflation already soaring? All these things, of course, will determine, the relative value and the relative stringency with which you should enforce these kinds of things. Then you start getting into really, really difficult things, which is, I can't tell you how many audit reports have come back about the problems with implementing the free cow and goat scheme. A little less on the goats, but increased, extreme number of problems with the free cow scheme. I mean, those of you who have looked into it, the complexity of it is horrendous, right? So in theory, the idea is good. You give women, especially rural women who have land and who have access to cattle feed type areas, vegetation, a cow, and you make them milk producers, you increase the total output of the state, you give them a revenue and so forth and so forth. They get cow dung and all these things. The problem is, if you buy those cows inside the state and you move them from one hand to another within a tight circle, A, you're driving up the price of cows because you got more money chasing the same number of cows. B, because you're not getting breeding of genetic pools that are different, you could increase a lot of internal problems. So the design of the program, I don't know, through whatever iteration, said you really have to get the cows from outside the state. Now the question is, who gets to decide which cow is worth buying and bringing and giving to which beneficiary? So then the program is designed to say, no, the government cannot buy the cow. The beneficiary must go to the next state and with the government kind of purchasing authorized person, and then buy the cow there and bring it back. They say, which cow? Oh, no, you must go and test the milking of the cow for 4 days to make sure it milks to a certain capacity, and then you must bring it back. Now, which cattle market in Andhra or Karnataka is going to allow somebody to test a cow's milking production for 4 days? So, this scheme has inherently got structural problems that were not thought through. And though it is supposed to have been in execution, it has failed in so many ways because it has got, many ways to fail. It has not been well thought through. And then you look at things that are even worse. I mean, you look at things like, now well past needs into wants, into grinders and mixies and fans and all that. And you start asking yourself, when somebody can walk down the street in most parts of society, most villages even, and buy ground dosa batter or idli batter for 5 rupees in packets, are you really going to, do that much better with having your own mixers and grinders and fans? Especially, sorry, somebody's not muted, I think. Especially at a state where not everybody has continuous supply of power and where energy is already subsidized only up to 100 units. So were I to give a lot of free goods like fans and mixies, grinders, and the latest one, our opponents put out washing machines, then really, you'd be creating multiple problems by yourself. The washing machine thing really gave me a laugh because 90% of the households, even in big cities like Madurai, don't have continuous running water, right? There's some structural problems we're trying to fix, but certainly in the rural areas, you don't have continuous running water. And as anybody who's ever had a washing machine knows, it's very hard to run a washing machine unless it has a pipeline of water. And then, of course, I would say egregiously bad schemes like giving 50% subsidy to scooters, 1 lakh scooters or bikes a year, which is bad for the environment, bad for the traffic, increases your dependency on petrol and diesel, or petrol in this case, and further tarnishes the demand for bus service and so forth. So, it's unjustifiable in most ways. So, if I put all of this together, I would say that really there are no black and white answers here. It depends, of course, on the many variables that I've said. But I'll go one step further. I'll say, at the end of the day, the execution is probably the most important aspect. It's one thing to say I have or I don't have a plan. It's another thing to say is well designed, not well designed. But if you don't have fundamentally good systems, good data, and therefore good execution, then everything else is irrelevant, right? A bad scheme can be redeemed through good data and good execution. A good scheme can be ruined through bad data and bad execution. And, I have been very clear to my chief minister and to many of the authorities I work with, IS officers, that in my mind, giving an undeserved benefit to somebody is marginally less bad than having somebody who doesn't get what they should get from the state. But giving something to somebody who has gamed the system to extract that benefit is infinitely worse. And in many cases, we can judge the intent. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. One of the 5 pillars that I talked about after we came to power and that I've kept on repeating about how we're going to improve the administration and governance is a data-centric governance model. And what does that mean? That we want to know who's who, we want to know who gets what, we want to know who's eligible for what, we want to know how many points somebody touches the government. Are the same people who are in the kind of free rice category also paying income tax, for example, right? I mean, these are 2 incongruous things. So we started some work. I think we came to office in May. Between May and June, we were mostly tied up with the second wave of COVID. We probably started real governance work in July. And I think around the middle or end of July, we announced this initiative. So it's been about 2.5, 3 months that we've been looking at the data. And just to give you 2 or 3 examples, the crop loan waiver that our predecessors did before we came, at least 50, 60% of the records had serious problems with them. The most egregious example that I listed in the assembly during my budget speech was an individual who had given detail for a crop they had planted, taken a loan, and then had it waived, except the land that they talked about was inside a government arts college owned by the government and not arable. It was not cultivable land. And yet that loan was also waived. And in real time, we have now been processing the dual loan waiver that my chief minister announced when he was leader of the opposition and during the campaign. And as he has pointed out himself, after we have been able to cross-reference the data, we have found that almost 2/3 of the loans were gamed by people, individuals who applied at 6 different places. More than 1 lakh of covers of so-called jewels pledged to get loans, empty covers, never had jewels in them in the first place. So, the extreme examples of malfeasance are just mind-boggling, but it tells you the value of data and the value of connectivity and the value of cross-reference, and put all together the value of execution. So, for example, we've created some new rules on this dual loan waiver. A, that it can only be given to people who identify themselves with the physical ID and matches the face, and B, only to them in person, and C, with an auditor of the cooperative societies, which sits under finance present, and those auditors we're giving special training, and then we're crossing them across districts so that they don't have collusion. So we'll send the auditor from Chennai district to Madurai district to validate, or something to that effect, not particularly those 2 districts, but cross district. So at the end of the day, I would say, before we look at this as too theoretical a question, maybe it's worth looking around the world. And we look around the world, and as I've said many times before, there's a very strong correlation between compassionate societies, between those that protect the weakest, the most in need, and the quality of life of citizens, not just the economic development, but the overall social development, and the Gini coefficient, how unequal a society is or isn't. And I give examples at a global level. If you compare places like Scandinavia, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, all relatively high tax, high benefit, free education, free maternity leave, free healthcare, better quality of life countries. You compare those to, even a country like the US, the quality of life doesn't quite match. And then within the US, you take states like California, New York, Minnesota that have very good protections, relatively speaking, for the poorest and weakest. And you can see where they start to separate from the not so progressive or not so compassionate states. And I've already made the mention within India, certainly of the 4 large rich states in India of Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Gujarat. Tamil Nadu stands on its own in terms of the relative development across both economic and social indicators taken together, doctors per 1,000 people, infant mortality, maternal mortality, girls enrolled in education, access to healthcare, doctors per 1,000 people, percentage of sanitization, percentage urbanization. Any of these measures you take, we stand in a separate place by ourselves. And surely that has something to do with being a society that has worked consciously for inclusion, for ensuring that the bottom is protected. Comes at a cost. Nothing comes free, right? I mean, surely there are many things that are wasted. Surely if we spend money, some of the time it goes to the wrong places, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously. We are just doing an exercise now where some preliminary data has come in that many people, many thousands of people who are listed as having expired in the civil register are still listed as receiving pension benefits in the government's pension systems, the monthly 1,000 rupees. So on the one hand, that's not good. We can correct it. On the other hand, there are also moral questions. If 1,000 rupees a month was what we considered the kind of living sustenance amount of money to be given to a widow or a differently able person back in 2011, then is it a fair and just society that still only provides 1,000 rupees a month in 2021? Should that number have been significantly increased? And why has it not? So, as with other things in life, there are relatively few black and white answers. Everything has nuance. Execution, administration, governance is as important as philosophy, planning, policy. But I think overall, the state of Tamil Nadu has benefited from a particular and unique approach it has taken. And certainly the Chief Minister has no intention of moving away from this model. If anything, probably we will expand on it, but with better data, with better integration, with better execution, with better checks and balances. And that's, that part is black and white for us. We have no doubt about it. Why don't I stop now? I've been speaking for about 35 minutes, and then maybe I can take questions that might be of greater value to the audience.
Any questions? Yeah, Gokul, go ahead.
Hi, sir. Good evening. I just want to know, when you have schemes like these, are there metrics that you look at to see whether they have been successful, in the sense that if you are giving out the gold, is there any metric that you look at? Or, for example, you mentioned cycles, they increase access to education. So do you look at those metrics to see whether it has been successful, or what are the metrics that you use to see if the scheme has been successful?
Yeah. I mean, some of these are easier to track than others, as you might imagine. And some of these, we are not a lot of the information is public. So it's not like we are working with hidden data, right? So if you look at either enrollment levels, or if you look at graduation levels, or if you look at, bank credit levels, or if you look at, number of complaints against usury or so forth. I'm not saying we're great, but almost all these statistics are either tracked by us. We have, incidentally, in one of the departments, the Chief Minister has asked me to look after. It's called Planning and Development. In that, we have a data and analytics department which does this. It goes and checks the effectiveness of programs, it checks whether they reached, it checks the consequences, so forth. If I was to tell you the truth, I'd say that is not used as much as it should have been in the past. A guy like me who came from a trading desk and who lives on data, then I lever up on it a lot more. But at some level, it's not the only benchmark, right? I mean, the outcomes of society are there for all to see. And were we really spending a lot of money without getting a lot of good, not only would we realize it statistically, but we'd realize it politically, because we're still a growing country, we're still a zero-sum game. So were we spending a lot of money in the wrong place, then surely the people would have felt the void of it in the right place. So there's some inherent systemic checks and balances. We do have professional kind of day jobs that are supposed to be looking at this. They've been doing some of it in the past. I suspect they're doing more of it now after I took the portfolio than ever before. And then we'll do a lot more of it still, partly internally, partly with partners like the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, where one of our other economic advisors, Professor Esther Duflo, is heading the Asia Initiative, and civil society, right? I mean, other people look at things like that.
Kanjik, go ahead with your question.
So I have two questions. Firstly, while the success of several of these social justice schemes is out in the open and it's visible, but then over time and over the years, it's become a very common visual that several of these social justice measures are used as tools by political parties to lure voters. So how do we prevent something like that from happening, as a tool? And the second one is that your party in its manifesto had promised 1,000 rupee allowance to women head of households. So while you have fulfilled the promise of increasing maternity leaves for women, how do you plan to finance this measure, which is given the situation of COVID and piling debts in the state?
Yeah, I think the first is that we are very clear that if a program works well, we should find that fewer and fewer people need it. And that's the whole point. We're lifting people out of this system. And our data as a percentage of society certainly shows that, and will continue to show that, I think. If you say, will politicians use it as kind of vote catchers? Look, politicians come from society, right? We don't fall from the sky. We're not dug up from the ground. We reflect society, and our job is to align ourselves to society. In some rare instances, we expect to lead society to where it needs to go, even if it doesn't want to go. But most of the time, politicians are not that kind of, we want to carve out the new world and all that. Most of the time, politicians want to kind of keep a little bit ahead of, a little bit behind where society is. I think the more developed a society becomes, its aspirations change a lot. I think the days in Tamil Nadu where you could just simply win by promising this freebie or that freebie or more of the same, I think those days are behind us. I think you have to say something of substance. We are measuring all the time. And I would say, for example, that we have gotten more traction with the public, for example, on the marginal reduction in petrol tax than probably some of these loan waivers that we have done. That just goes to tell you that some things are universal, and that people understand that these things have also a multiplier effect and a prospective effect, as opposed to much less in other things. As far as the 1,000 rupees goes, initially that was only part of the Chief Minister's 10-year vision, that we would get there within the next 10 years rather than any given date. As with any other party, these manifestos don't come and say, by this date, by this date, by this date. I must confess that my understanding of Indian politics was, that these manifestos were not particularly well developed or well written. It's not like the party conference is held and 5,000 people get input into this. These documents emerge through some process. I haven't changed my mind. I'm not sure these manifestos are phenomenally well planned or immensely internally debated outcomes. Having said that, I've also been shocked at how focused my chief minister is on delivering these. And I don't mind confessing that I've had conversations with him and with others and say, listen, so many parties just give their manifestos and don't do anything. If you look at our predecessors in 2016, they won the election in the state, not having delivered any fraction of what they had promised in 2011. If you look at the union government in 2019, where were the 2 crore jobs? Where was all the black money brought back? Where was all the stuff? Nothing happened, and they came back to power. So it's not even clear to me that people really believe you when you say that. Having said that, I'm still shocked. Every day the Chief Minister tells us, where are we on this, where are we on this, where are we on this? And we translated the bulk of those 500 something commitments into actionable items for the different departments, allocating them to ministers, so forth. And I must say that it was beyond my wildest expectations that we would deliver on 200 and something of them within 6 months of taking office, because certainly many of them have such great costs and such great groundwork required that it's not realistic to get that done all within any short time. But as far as 1,000 rupees go, the first thing we're finding out, and really it was on the discussion just to show how important it is. It was on the discussion with our global economic advisors at the second Economic Advisory Council meeting that happened on Monday night, about 48 hours ago now, and extensively. And Professor John Reyes wrote a note before it and wrote a note after it, and I'm looking at some of the data so forth. So really, it's not that complicated or that astronomical in size. It could be up to 2 crore families. Tamil Nadu's population is such that there's, we can use electricity meter connections, we can use ration cards, we can use voter databases. Whichever way you look at it, there's about 2 crore families. My best guess is that, certainly families like mine don't need it. So if we start moving up and down the spectrum in a state with a 2 lakh, 40,000 or something per capita income, which is 20,000 rupees a month, and a fairly low Gini coefficient, meaning a much more homogenized and much less stratified society compared to, let's say, Gujarat or Maharashtra or Karnataka, certainly compared to UP or Bihar, then maybe the numbers are not as we thought. It's not like 2 crore people or 2 crore women should get the money. It's probably in the tens of lakhs. And that's what our data is showing us. And then you multiply that by 12,000 rupees a year. And it's not actually, it's a big number by any stretch, but given the scale of Tamil Nadu's economy and the scale of our budget this year, I presented a budget to the Assembly, I think it was 3,55,000 something crores, and estimated GSDP of 21,36,000 crores or so. So, a 12 or 15 or 18,000 crore is not an overwhelming number. I personally am much, much more concerned that we should know who is who. We should have a family portrait of every portrait. We should find out who's benefiting from what schemes. We should find out who needs what help more than other help. And we should find out, therefore, to get this money into the hands of people for whom it would make a difference. That's what I say about everything. But I say that more specifically about this one, or more vigorously about this one than any other. And I think these are all things that we can do reasonably. We're a big state. We're going to start announcing some of the things we have done and some of the things we've discovered. And while it's a very difficult time based on many years of mismanagement, plus demonetization, plus pandemic, we have borne it better than others, right? All crises exacerbate inequality. And that was true of both demonetization and the pandemic. Tamil Nadu suffered much less than the Indian average or than poor states did. And so our ability to bounce back and get back to a relatively good trajectory is probably better than most. And so I'm not overly concerned about the time. The Chief Minister would like it done yesterday. So we work within that time frame, but we'll get it done sooner rather than later. And the money is not my biggest concern. The data, the execution, the fairness, the model is much more my concern.
Anjali.
Hello, sir. So my question is about the white paper that was released a few months ago. So in that, it's mentioned that the subsidies have reached the level of 27.6% of the revenue expenditure. And there's a line that says that the urgent measures for improving, targeting, and reorientation of subsidies. So my question is, could you elaborate on what exactly is meant by reorientation of subsidies and whether it could potentially affect the existing subsidies?
Yeah, listen, as I said, right, the philosophy is very clear. We want to make sure that those who need it get it, We want to make sure that those who don't need it don't get it. And most of all, we want to make sure that those who game the system don't get it at all. And, we've been doing a lot of work on the electricity front, because that's really where the bulk of our immediate concerns are. And we lose about, on average, 2 or 3 rupees a unit for every unit of electricity concerned. We lose about 60 rupees a kilometer for every public transport bus that travels. So these are not sustainable models. So when we go and break it down, we start to see some very clear things, that this is more inertia and kind of lack of application of mind than anything else. If we look at the EB subsidy, for example, of the annual subsidy of effectively, or the loss, let's call it. I don't know what part is subsidy, what part is not, but of the annual loss of 30-something thousand crores, within the retail sector is about 20,000 crores or so, within what we consider free electricity to agriculture, but actually includes a lot of line loss and a lot of theft. I mean, in Theni district in the Kambam Valley, I personally have highlighted a lot of instances, and an affidavit has been filed by the PWD that something like 24,000 horsepower of unapproved or beyond the norms motors are being run. That's about 40-45 lakhs a day of free electricity going to the wrong people who are stealing water using the free electricity. So it's like we are enabling the criminal behavior at a greater cost to ourselves. So even within, then we start breaking down, even within the residential sector, the bulk of the kind of 100 free units benefit goes to people who use more than 500 units of electricity. So, once you start going for these kind of blanket subsidies or blanket free items, in some cases they're very targeted because we have a social justice agenda. The Chief Minister says all women will travel free because he wants to ensure that women have access to go to work and get out of the house. But if you look at it from a different perspective, it's not clear that we should keep, let's say, bus charges at the lowest level possible, because we're catering then to the people who make 5,000, 8,000 domestic work, low end of the pyramid. Surely there are also people who earn 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 rupees who get on a bus and they're still buying tickets at the level we intended for the 3,000 or 5,000. So in the white paper, we have pointed out several anomalies without elaborating too much about them, but we think people will read into the lines in the transport corporations before we ever consider paying for diesel or the depreciation of the bus or anything. For 1 rupee of revenue, we're paying 1.5 rupees of wages. No business in the world will run like that. Even if you see it as a service, I have no problem. In many countries, they provide free transportation to the weakest sections of society. In many other countries, you have a card, like in Hong Kong, you have a octopus card that basically the government knows who you are, and the rate at which you pay is based on whether you're a student or a retiree or a normal working person or poor and deserve subsidies, etc. So, there are so many models around the world. And so we are trying to find that balance, that our value system of economic inclusion and justice meaning we give free to those who cannot afford to pay, and we charge to those who can afford to pay. How do we implement those in a way that these models work out? And it's doable, right? The math is in the right place. So far, what we have seen. Of course, it's a sea change, so it'll require some political will, because But part of that is changing the debate. Part of that is getting society involved in the debate. So one of the main functions I see is making things transparent, making things easily understandable, and getting them out into debate. And by debate, of course, we care about journalists and the students at the ACJ, but we care also about the tea shops, the bus stands, the farms. We want people to talk about what kind of society do we want to be, and what should the government do that is fair and right. And this helps us as we get feedback on what should be our priorities and how we should drive this.
So my second question is about the white paper also mentions that there was an irresponsible degradation of financial status of local bodies in the last 5 years and must be corrected at once. So what are the steps that the government plans to take to correct the degradation?
Well, there's on both sides, right? One is on the income side and one is on the expense side. If you look on the income side, property tax rates have not been raised in 10 or 12 years. And, we are not the only state in India. We're not the only kind of big metropolis in Chennai. So you compare Chennai to Bangalore, you look at Tamil Nadu property tax rates compared to other states' property tax rates. And we are way behind because we haven't raised them in 8 years. So on the revenue side, the local bodies have become, much more dependent on state aid and are not raising their own revenues properly, and they need to fix that. On the expense side, they have been a bit profligate for the sake of corruption in many cases, as I've said. For example, I was in a meeting earlier today. Almost everywhere else in the world, the smart city scheme, which is a joint union and state scheme, required the increase in monitoring, increase in CCTV cameras, improving risk management, crime control. In Chennai, for example, the cameras monitor the trash bins. And when they get close to fill, then it's time for them to be picked up and taken out, or they put sensors in the trash. In Madurai, 0 of the 1,000 crores or 1,200 crores allocated was spent on any of these things. It just went to tenders that could be given margins to the ministers for them to make money. So, these things are gaps in capability that we have to get back. If I focus on Madurai for another minute, I'll say, lots of bills have not been paid. The local bodies owe hundreds, if not thousands of crores to the Tamil Nadu Water Administration Department, as well as to the Tamil Nadu Electricity Department. These are not acceptable kind of balances and shirking of payments. Also in Madurai, for example, many of these projects have created worse problems than if they did not exist. In my constituency, there are 2 major construction projects that are done. And one of them has parking spaces for 1,100 bikes and 110 cars. The other one has parking spaces for 400 and something bikes and 40 something cars. None of these has been assessed in terms of what the traffic flow into the single ramp parking garages would do to the traffic of the area. I am really worried about how we'll get the cars in and out of the bikes in and out of these places. And, the complexities and the traffic jams that will arise from trying to bottleneck this many vehicles into this smaller, into one ramp and one lane. So, those are the kinds of things that are irresponsible. Of course, they have to get their fiscal balance right. They have to first raise their revenues, then they have to pay all the dues that they have. They need to be much more competent. Part of the problem was that there was no local body elections for the last 5 years, right? So the villages, at least, they ran it like 6 months before this election, but before the main election. But the cities and the towns and the municipalities, we have not had local councillors for since 2016. So it's if that's what democracy is supposed to do. You're supposed to have locally elected officials who are worried to go back and tell their voters why they allow stuff like this to happen. Then they will act. But if you don't have any elected official, and the last, the first port of call is the last man in the hierarchy, who's the Minister for Municipal Administration sitting in Delhi, who's impervious to any kind of intrusion, then they'll do whatever they want. And that's what has happened.
Dima.
Good evening, sir. So my question is regarding how political parties and politicians think. So our democracy is designed in a way that incentives of political parties is in the short run, right? Because there's a 5-year life cycle. Elections happen every 5 years, and usually welfare schemes are designed to for 5 years to get the returns in 5 years. Whereas education and healthcare are sectors, when you invest in them, it usually the returns are long drawn out. It takes usually 10-15 years. So if you can, like, as a politician and a political party, how do you manage this short-term and long-term sort of, short-term incentive of actually winning elections, but at the same time, long-term benefit for the society? So like, how does a political party think in this perspective?
Yeah, I mean, all over the world, this is a problem. I think the professor explained it to me most simply was in the US, and they said, listen, developmental economics, if you are a growing country and you don't have, kind of excess liquidity, you're scrambling, the simplest advice is take every spare dollar and put it into elementary education. That gives you the biggest bang for the buck relative to almost any other investment. That's still true. But the problem in a democracy is that for that investment to give returns will take you 15 years or 20 years for those people to grow up and reach the workforce. And you'll have to face 3 elections or 4 elections by then, depending on the country. And the public may not be as patient. And so, most of us have to do this balancing act that we have to think about both the short term and the long term. I think most politicians try to do as best as they can. In fact, ironically, in 2016, when I gave my maiden speech, I said to then Chief Minister Ms. Jayalalitha, I said, instead of keeping on reminding us 20 times a day that you have come back for a second 5-year term after a 34-year gap that a government has been re-elected, why don't you do something about it and use the fact that you got a 10-year stretch, which almost nobody has had in 40 years, to actually think longer term and do long-term kind of policies. Of course, she was not with us for very long. But certainly, at least our chief minister, at least our plan, at least our manifesto, and our internal kind of planning since we came is thinking longer term. So, for example, much of my own departments, the finance department, the human resource department, the planning development department, I am talking about a 10-year plan. Ideally we'll be around to execute it. If not, let somebody else come and pick it up. But if you don't have at least a 10-year plan, it's very hard to go 6 months to 1 year to keep jumping. In Madurai Corporation, for example, we have got a bunch of stakeholders together, started the process, and we want to come up with a Madurai City master plan. The last time a master plan was done for Madurai City was 1995. And so we want a master plan for Madurai City and for about a 20 to 30 kilometer radius going outside of the city in terms of not just 2031, but 2041. We want a master plan for the next 20 years. And we'll then start doing our projects within that plan. To be fair, Ms. Jayalalitha also had a 10-year plan in 2013. She called it Vision 2023. Problem with master plans or long-term plans is that if you miss the first few years of execution and targets, then they become irrelevant because you can't make up the gap because of the way compounding works. If you miss the first 2 or 3 years of the kind of growth rates that you're supposed to hit, then you can't get to the goal in the next 7 years because you'd need effectively, let's take an example. Let's say that your plan calls for something like 13% a year. We have talked about 1 trillion economy in 10 years. That requires about 13% of the year GSDP growth in nominal terms, meaning including the effect of inflation, which would be 4, 5%, 5.5%, at least in India. So you're looking at real growth of 7, 8%, and then 4, 5% inflation. So on the notional growth of 12, 13%, and you do that every year for 10 years, and you'll go from being about 300 billion now to 1 trillion in 10 years. But were we to lose the first 3 years and have only 6 or 7 or 5, then the remaining 7 years, we'd need something like 18 a year or 19 a year. And that becomes almost impossible. So really, though the long-term plans are important, even for long-term plans to be successful, you need to have the first part of the plan work right. Let's say the first 3 years we grow at 13, 14%. And then the 1 year it drops down to 10, and then we can make it up by 16, and then we can go back to 13 again. So it's drops of small amounts later in the cycle are easily recoverable. Large amounts or earlier in the cycle are not recoverable. And that's why we are so driven and focused to get in the right place now. using the bounce from the COVID, using the bounce from the lockdown, and return to economic activity. We're seeing that actually. Things like petrol usage between the first week of, or the first 2 weeks of August and the first 2 weeks of September, petrol consumption went up almost 35-37%. So we're seeing a return to economic activity that is of huge proportions, at least in Tamil Nadu, because we did a lot of demand stimulation and we never let the economy go that far into recession. I'm not sure what it is for the rest of India, but we'll wait and see.
Bhavya.
Hi, sir. Good evening. So my question is that you had mentioned in an interview a few months back that your major concern is to maintain liquidity, right? And then that the main priority to be to focus on revenue, interest containment, and debt containment. And additionally, to reduce the borrowing to finance interest payments, but rather pay more attention to capital development, right? So in the budget, which was presented for 2020-2021, the budgeted interest payments actually saw an increase as compared to the previous years. So amidst increasing interest payments and increasing focus on welfare schemes and also capital development, how does the government actually, what measures do you think should be put into practice that can help a government maintain a balance between revenue, interest containment, debt, and to maintain enough liquidity?
Yeah, let me make those simpler. I think the first is, I didn't say that I have a concern about liquidity. I said when I came to the job, the first thing I did was ensure that I have liquidity, and it's fine. Anyway, state governments are not like companies, right? You can't really run out of liquidity. There's so many places you can find money to use in the short term. So I'm not saying we're flush with liquidity. I'm saying I just wanted to make sure that that was under control, and it was, and then I moved on to other things. As for the second part, when you compare year-over-year budgets, you should never look at the numbers as numbers, because you see there's the effect of inflation built in, there's the effect of GDP growth built in. So even if I am improving, for example, I have made a commitment that this year I will reduce the revenue deficit for the first time in 7 years. 7 years in a row, the revenue deficit has gone up. Now, what does that mean? Even if the number were higher, as long as the increase was lower than the increase in the size of the economy or the size of the budget or inflation, that means I've still improved. In fact, I've gone one step further. I said I will actually bring down the revenue deficit in rupee terms, which means that I will have double improved it. Not only have I not grown as fast as GSDP or inflation or the budget, but in today's rupees, I'm paying less than I was paying in yesterday's rupees, which were worth more than today's rupees. Because of inflation, today's rupees are worth less than yesterday's rupees. So when you compare performance, absolute numbers become meaningless if you take long periods of time. For example, the budget of Tamil Nadu today is about 3,55,000 crores. When I first came to be a MLA in 2016, the budget was about 2 lakh crores. Right. So if I say what percentage of GSDP or what percentage of the budget, now I'm reasonable. If I say what was the absolute payment, then the numbers become confounded by inflation and by increase of the scale of the economy. So I would say that my focus is to reduce the revenue deficit, because borrowing to invest is always a good thing as long as the law allows me to do it. In fact, it would be irresponsible to not borrow and invest. I've said it many times before that there is no better investor than the state itself, right? Because we borrow at the lowest rates possible compared to any other investor. We are guaranteed outcomes more than any other investor because the government doesn't do rent seeking on itself. The corruption will not stop a government project, and basically the barriers to successful outcomes are fewer. And we generally invest in such assets that they have high multiplier effects. We build ports or water systems or hospitals or roads or things that will then create a great spurt in economic activity or in productivity or in people's ability to get to work. Excuse me. So these kinds of things are not. So we want to do capital. So really my focus is that I want to reduce the revenue deficit. I want to, so I can do that two ways. I can increase the revenues and I can increase the revenues faster than the expenses and faster than the total size of the budget of the economy. Then as a percentage of GSDP, if I increase it, then it's even better, right? Because just increase means the GSDP is also growing. So I've had a very clear target. I said that at one time we used to get about 10.5% of our GSDP as our revenues. That has dropped to 7.5 before the pandemic and down to 6.5 after the pandemic. So our ambition is to get back to 10.5 as quickly as possible. That is probably my primary goal. If I do that, then I get the best of all worlds, because my my revenue goes up faster than my denominator, which is GSDP, and also in return, which is the interest as a percentage of revenues, my revenues, which is the denominator, goes up faster than my interest payment goes up. So my interest as a percentage of revenue drops. So really, I want to increase revenues fast as a percentage of GSDP. Therefore, I want interest payments to drop as a percentage of revenues. Everything else will take care of itself. The debt and all, I'm not that worried about. Everybody's debt is perpetually growing, particularly if I include, the effect of inflation. Debt is always increasing. Very few times, even the US. The only time I think in the last 50 years that the US paid back debt was under Bill Clinton, when I was in the US around 15 years ago. Under every type of government since then, under Republicans and Democrats, it has continuously kept on increasing, right? So that's what happens in most countries. In fact, the macroeconomic equation requires there to be people to borrow. As long as the wealth of the world and the savings of individuals keep growing, somebody must be on the other side borrowing it, whether it's corporations or governments. So, those things don't worry me a lot. It's really these two things: revenues as a percentage of our economy, and therefore bring down interest as a percentage of our revenues. We can do that multiple ways, but the easiest way is to grow revenues fast and not borrow for revenue spending. That's the two easiest ways to bring your economy back on track. So we're doing both those, yeah.
Hello, sir. Do you think the Aadhaar infrastructure has the capacity to help governments mitigate inclusion and exclusion errors for such subsidy schemes, or do you think we need something else?
It's a very good question. As with all things, I have multiple levels of thinking about this. One level is that I think the Aadhaar is better than nothing. And we have used it in the last few months, as I told you, for our initiatives quite a bit. Another level is to say the Aadhaar database, as many people have proven beyond a doubt, has been compromised fundamentally. And when I say compromised fundamentally, I mean not that somebody who should be there is not there. That is a fixable error. But there are thousands and thousands of cases of people who don't exist, or whose face and retina and fingerprint don't match the name and the ID. So there's multiple fake records in the Aadhaar database that's been proven beyond doubt. Now, once you have some fake records, it's like pouring poison in the well, because once I have the fear that just because your Aadhaar retina scan checks out, you're not really who you say you are because there's a fake entry in there, then I got a problem. That means it means nothing to me, because you may still turn out to be somebody that I have no way of knowing, because just because your scan or your fingerprint matches doesn't mean anything. It could be a fakely inserted record that I've just validated. Validating a record means nothing. There's one step beyond that, which is that the real cause of concern for us is very poor people, and there's many problems with retina scanning and fingerprint scanning, as you know, especially if you're poor and work hard, and your fingerprints have been blurred and all that. But the final concern I have is that the Aadhaar database is a union government database. Though we can access it at some kind of micro level, in reality, Reliance Industries probably has better access to that database than the state of Tamil Nadu does. So these are things that we need to fix. And in fact, I've talked about this multiple times. Niti Aayog seems sympathetic. The union government, at least some of the ministers I work with, seem to understand. So we need to come up with some kind of a data sharing model between the states and the union, of course, while protecting individual privacy and so forth. But what we have right now does not work for us. We need, and Aadhaar is better than anything else right now. it is not by any means either foolproof or the best design.
Krupa.
Sir, in like here you, in terms of petrol and diesel cost, you had to cut down the price of petrol. For diesel, the price was not cut, but what was chosen was to provide subsidies. So can you tell me what was the logic behind doing like this, and what has been like the impact?
Yeah, as I say, it's really a question of targeting, right? What are you trying to achieve, and where can you afford to take the loss, and what are the implications? I've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to spend too much time about it. But as I say on diesel, well, in everything, the biggest concern I have is I don't know who's buying what, right? Like if it was, let's say this was Singapore, and every vehicle, every bike, every car, every bus, every truck has a unique ID, or RFID, a radio frequency ID that can be read by a scanner. Not that far different from the FASTag, okay? If I had that and I had the ability to tax discriminably, where I tell the petrol bunk, you get this kind of vehicle, you put this much tax. You get that kind of vehicle, you put that much tax. You get, a big SUV, you charge them plus $10 above the current tax rate. You get a small car, you charge them $5 less. You get a small business or a small farmer, goods transport vehicle, you charge. So that is really being able to target my subsidies to the people that I believe I want to help, and reduce the income from them for the sake of societal good. Since I don't have that luxury, I have to start looking for approximations. And the approximations that were available to us in the limited period of time, and the overwhelming urge of the chief minister that we had to fulfill as many pledged, campaign promises as possible, we just settled on that, in the sense that petrol, very many fewer cars run on petrol, and the greatest, and even big trucks and all that don't run on petrol. The greatest consumers of petrol by far are the 2.6 crore two-wheelers in Tamil Nadu. And so that was a direct benefit that we thought would reach pretty much half the population, instantaneously. And with diesel, it started getting a lot more complex about, boats versus tractors versus public transport corporations versus large cargo carriers versus, and to be honest, none of our economic advisors was a big buyer of the fuel tax cut. And so, we did it from the chief minister's perspective, because he said, I said so, and so I'll do it. I was sanguine. I liked a couple of things about it. One, that I had personally stood up and argued against the VAT increase in the assembly when I was an opposition member, saying this is wrong to increase input costs and create likelihood of inflation or marginal squeeze of profit margins for fishermen, farmers. So I was happy to be consistent with my position that when I was in opposition, I argued against this increase, and therefore I came and was part of bringing it back down. The second was that I genuinely felt there would be a multiplier effect in this one, because we were directly giving it to every individual. And that part has been proven true, in the sense that when we take polling and so forth, the part that most people tell us they really like was that we reduced the petrol tax. It's reached more people more effectively than any other subsidy or scheme that we have done. And partly, I think we wanted to show to the rest of the country that it can be done and we can live with it, right? I think like the union, the RBI Monetary Policy Committee has been keeping on telling the union government for the last, 6 months or a year, that you really ought to reduce the taxes, the union taxes on petrol and diesel, and that will give you a good multiplier effect on the economy. And they have been resisting, they've not done it at all. And so we thought, let us set an example, let us show how good how big the multiplier effect will be, and let us get the debate. As with everything, we want the debate to expand, and we want more people talking about this. And I think we really achieved our limited objective, though I must confess that even day before yesterday, our economic advisors were not thrilled with it. So it is what it is. Sometimes we do things that are, for the people, even if they're not strictly by the textbook.
We're completely run out of time, but Aryan Singh, you can go ahead with your question. Aryan.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Good evening, sir. So since you talked about your approach towards adopting a data-centric governance, but there's a case that often acquiring more data isn't going to make it's data-centric and may even make you less data-centric. For example, if each data set you acquire has a different data model and you just plop them in a data lake without any attempt to harmonize them, then you're getting less and less data-centric. So, and also following a data-centric approach, an organization often fails to act as data-driven. So how is your government coping up with the challenges while being a data-centric and database governance?
Yeah, I don't think we have any challenges at all, right? I ran a large global operation where we use 100 times this with 1,000 times the complexity. So these are all basic steps that people have done, tens of years ago. We are far behind the curve. There's no complexity. It's like basic vanilla stuff, right? Every single step we take, we get benefit, and there's probably 2 or 3 years worth of improvements we'll make before we start wondering whether there's marginal cost of complexity or parallel or whatever. It's a no-brainer. We are so far back. These are all it's like being in kindergarten. Right? It's not complicated.
Ashwin, you can ask your question, and with that we'll end it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, sir. So good evening. You created and revamped the party's IT cell for the campaign. So it is nice to see a data-driven politician as the finance minister. So since you mentioned that we need to do better in terms of data availability, what are some plans of the state of Tamil Nadu to bring people under a system to collect quality-rich data while maintaining data privacy? What is your suggestion on it?
Sorry, what was the word before something data? What was the adjective there?
In terms of data availability, sir?
No, you said
quality-rich data, okay. Better quality of data.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that the state actually has a lot of records in different places, some not digitized, certainly not integrated, certainly not cross-referenced. So before I ever ask for new information and worry about where the defining line on what can I say, privacy versus the greater good, we still have miles to go. I'll just give you an example. In my constituency, there are 240-something thousand voters. By law, I'm allowed to do two things. I'm allowed to get the voter list. Otherwise, as a candidate, I wouldn't know who are my eligible voters. And so every candidate who pays the deposit of 10,000 rupees gets 2 sets of data. At one time, we would only get it in printed books. Now we get it in CDs. Some of us have better technology than others. We can absorb that into searchable, sortable databases. But these days, data is available. There's the day I entered elections in 2016, multiple people were trying to sell me so-called Aadhaar databases, which I never took. But once you have the digitized data, then the question is what you do with it. And then there's a second piece of information that everybody has, whether they use or not, which is that at the booth on the day of polling, we are all allowed to have multiple agents who validate whether the voter who comes to vote is really the voter that they say they are, and therefore that the booth is not rigged or captured, or the process is not subverted. Now, when our agents sit in the booth, of course, they tick off to prevent that person coming a second time. Let's say that somebody forgot to put ink on them. At least we'll know this vote has already been cast. Or if somehow a fake slipped through, when the next person comes saying I'm the real person, at least we'll know there's a conflict here. So, because errors sometimes happen, and we only discover them retrospectively when the real person comes. It's hard to process, a couple of lakh voters across 200, or in this case, because of COVID, almost 400 booths or 350 booths in 8 hours. But most people don't take that data back and do anything with it. So what I do and what many of the places that I can aid the party to do, we take that data back and we re-enter it into the computer. So we know what has happened to voting patterns, not just at a booth level or at a block level or at a ward level, but at an individual level. So for example, I was shocked to find that between 2019 and 2021, though the overall vote count, the polled vote count, only changed by about 2,000 votes, or less than that, 1,800 votes, that really almost 30,000 people who had voted in 2019 did not come to vote in 2021. Some of them because they passed on or left Madurai and shifted their vote to some other place. But a significant portion of them, 16,000, 17,000 people, simply had not come to the booth who had come last time. And then another 31,000 something people who had not voted in 2019, either because they did not live in Madurai then, or they were not yet 18 years old, they were the old, below 18s, or people who basically had stayed in Madurai, not bothered to come to vote in 2019 and had come in 2021. That was mind-boggling to me, right? I mean, just think about it. When the overall vote count has changed only about 1,800 votes, who would have predicted that something like 23, 24% of the actual voters differed between last time and this time? It's not the same election at all. 1 in 4 voters is a different voter, right? So when we get that kind of data, we start saying, what is the point of analyzing last year to this year at a booth level, at a block level, at a ward level, at a constituency level? It's irrelevant. It's not even the same person. Only about 75% of the people are the same, and they probably don't change their vote. So one of the biggest things I learned from this is that when this old saying that people vote with their feet is actually true, very few people come, punch the lever for black this time and white next time. If they are enthused, they come and punch the vote. If they can be enthused both ways, enthused by a positive desire or enthused by negative kind of backlash. But they have to get worked up enough to come to, particularly in my constituency, because I don't pay for votes. I state the policy that I will not pay, and I don't pay them. And that's actually detrimental to turnout. Let's be very clear. Some people cannot afford to come to leave their day job or leave their day's earnings or not cook for their family or do whatever. In fact, democracy is not that even. Some people simply cannot afford to take the 2 or 3 hours out of their routine to come and vote. That's the reality of the world. It's much less so in urban areas and in Tamil Nadu, but it's true all over the country. So that means that when you don't have enough incentive to come, or when you have other costs that are built into the system, actually people come when they are motivated to vote rather than the other way around. They don't come and swing left, right, left, right. If they're not interested, they don't come, they don't care. And so when we realized this, we were really nervous. What does that mean? If this, I do it for mine, I do it for few, I don't do it for all 234. But if mine is typical, that means that this election is not at all the same election as the last election. And therefore we were nervous, though we thought we were going to win. Going into the election, we thought that our 23-point-something% victory in 2019 was the best predictor, most likely, estimator of highest likely estimator of the 2021 margin. But in fact, it was not. We won 2021 only by about 5-point-something% compared to the 23% we had won. And that's because the voters were changed. The voters who were not enthusiastic about the ADMK did not come last time. The voters who were very strongly against the BJP and the leadership came out last time. The voters this time came out as much about ADMK as they did about DMK, as much about caste, as much about other things. The union government was not a factor in the elections nearly at all. And it was much more about other issues. And in my case, by good planning, good execution for 5 years and MLA, whatever, my margin of victory actually rose from, when the DMK won overall Tamil Nadu by 23%, my constituency, my coalition partner, the CPM MP, only won by 20 or 21%. Highest of all the MLA constituencies in his MP, highest margin, highest vote share, greatest improvement, etc., but still only 20. This time, all the other constituencies saw a decline, my margin went up to 23 or 24%, though the DMKs overall fell by 5, and I won by 34,000 something votes without paying 1 rupee. That is what data does for you. That is what data analysis and planning your strategy and your execution and your campaign based on your understanding of what is happening does for you. So the data that exists even, we are not using, or we're not capturing, and we're not putting it into a usable form. If that's true in politics, that's certainly true in government, right? Because in politics, this is our lifeblood. In government, we say, it's somebody else's responsibility. This department is that department, somebody else. So, it's having an understanding, it's capturing it granular, it's understanding how to interpret it and analyze it, and then most of all, how to use what you have learned and how to create a strategy based on your learnings. And it's continuous, right? None of these things are black and white. We form a model, we think we understand. Then we try it out. Then we say, no, it's not quite that. It's something else. Then we kind of get new data. Then we get another election. Then we put the data. So maybe we refine it this way. So we're continuously learning. All these are inherently non-deterministic models. They're evolving all the time, and our understanding, we hope, gets marginally better every time.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, sir. We have completely run out of time, and thank you for being so patient and answering questions across a wide spectrum of topics. It's been great, and we would like to give you a virtual send off.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening in, and we log off.